All right. Good evening, everybody. I am really happy that you're all here. I am. This is part of the It's Noble Presents interview series that I recently started, and I'm excited to welcome this evening Gary Michuta, who has been someone that I've gotten to know over the last couple years, largely through my work at Across the Tiber, and I greatly respect and admire the work he does. And while I have not personally read his most recent book, this evening we're going to be talking about it as well as some related subjects. So, without further ado, I'm going to invite Gary on in, and then we'll kind of give a proper introduction both to him and to his work. So, um, let's see. All right, let's see if hello, Gary. Can you hear me? And I think can everyone see Gary? Let's see. Gary, can you
Yes,
hear me? Let's start
can.
with that.
Yeah, I can hear you, and I can see you.
All right,
So
fantastic.
life
Well,
is good.
I
Yeah.
think we're good. Well, I appreciate it. This is the first time I've done it with this sort of fancier template that I got going. So I'm still kind of working out the kinks of the live stream. So that's why I'm
Oh,
belaboring this kind of beginning setup because I would hate for us to get into like the most brilliant conversation ever, right? Only to have found out that we're talking to each other and no one else.
yeah.
And
If you get into a brilliant conversation with me, it's worth recording because that doesn't happen very often, if ever.
Oh well, then we're definitely in trouble because I was relying on you to make it brilliant. So then we're definitely in trouble then in this evening. But we're having several people have confirmed that we are indeed live and audible, visible, all of the above. Oh, but now I have something in frame, right? There's always something. But hey, I need to lean into that whole perfection is the enemy of greatness or goodness in this case kind of concept. So but Gary, no, I know I said that, kind of previously in the solo intro, but I really do. I appreciate you so much, both in terms of your contributions to the kind of online and printed world of apologetics, and then also more specifically and more personally, you've done a lot for Cross the Tiber and our passengers, and yeah, I'm proud to call you a friend, and I'm just happy to be on this side of the interview. To be honest with you, it's been on your channel a few times, and you've gotten to lead the conversation. So now I'm kind of selfishly excited to be able to pick your brain and guide the conversation a little bit. But
Awesome.
I know I've said a lot, but Gary, for the people who maybe don't know you, do you mind just giving a bit of a personal introduction and yeah, let people know who you are and what you've been up to?
Yeah. Well, I started in apologetics back in the early 1990s. I ran a 401c3 corp called I Faith Inc. Published a magazine. Um, let's see. Had a dramatic reconversion to the faith. And since then, I did the ministry for a while. Ultimately, we had to close shop, but I focused now on writing books, and I also have a radio show called Hands On Apologetics on uh, Virgin Most Powerful Radio, and yeah, I guess that covers it. I don't know if I'm missing anything.
Well,
If
yeah.
I
I mean,
did,
I,
let
th-
me
I
know.
think author of many great books. I mean, kind of perhaps most recently, the Gospel Truth: How We Can Know What Christ Taught. But also, kind of maybe most prominently, at least in my mind. But correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe this is not true for everybody. But why Catholic Bibles are bigger? At least that's my kind of my favorite of yours personally. But that
Yeah.
may be because I haven't dived into the other ones yet. So, so
Uh,
don't so take that with a. But I do. But seriously, I think it's been your work with the canon is something that I think is very, very notable. How did you get involved in that in particular?
yeah, well, when I'm doing my ministry, I noticed that the one question, no matter what conference either we put on or I was at, there'd always be questions on why there's 7 Old Testament books that are in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, but not in Protestant and Jewish Bibles.
Hmm.
And so I thought, I'm sure there's probably plenty of Catholic books out there that address the Deuterocanon, those 7 books. Turns out the last one written by a Catholic, pretty much dedicated to that subject, was done in like 1898.
Oh wow.
So I figured, hey, there's a niche here, especially since it's such an important question. So I was doing research. I came up with why Catholic Bibles are bigger. I actually wrote a few books. I have the Case for the Deuterocanon,
Hmm.
where I set forth a positive argument for it. and 15 Myths book where I debunk. It's just a little book where I debunk, common myths about the Old Testament canon. And thank you for bringing that up because I forgot. I also have a YouTube channel with William Albrecht and David Zavaras called Apocrypha Apocalypse, and that whole channel is dedicated to nothing but Old Testament canon issues.
That's fantastic. I'm glad you mentioned that as well. I'll be sure to add that kind of after the fact. I can add that in the description for people who might, so they can kind of access that more easily. But I've known about it for a while, but only recently started exploring it. And I've known about both of your work separately, yours and Williams. But it's really quite something to see all go at it together. It's sort of a tour de force of kind of all of these ideas. And I mean, is that a fair kind of way to describe it? I mean, it's sort of a very in-depth and rigorous kind of, step-by-step approach to kind of all of these issues. So for someone who's looking for kind of a very rigorous and in-depth, video series, I would say that's kind of, it seems to be kind of the only one that I know of, at least right now. So,
Yeah, yeah, it's a pretty small niche. Yeah, we're both research nerds, so this is where we get to geek out on our own channel, and it's like one of the most important topics, in my humble opinion, that
absolutely.
separates Catholics and Protestants. So it's a subject worth doing.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I know for myself personally, it's always hard. And every time I kind of boil it down to a single issue, it feels somewhat reductive, when you talk about your conversion. But I do know that among the most prominent issues, kind of the most prominent dominoes to fall in my own story, absolutely was kind of revisiting Sola Scriptura, and kind of the related issues, certainly what we're talking about now. So it's fascinating. I think maybe because of that and because of the prominence, I think not only my own conversion, but I think a lot of people's conversion. I mean, kind of starting to, because it comes back to the authority issue in many cases, right? I mean, when we start to revisit the canon, revisit Sola Scriptura, we start to revisit ecclesial authority, and then that kind of opens a whole other can of worms, which I'm sure we could talk about for hours by itself. But yeah, so it's actually maybe just interesting though, back to the canon subject, that there wasn't more on it, to be honest with you. Like, I'm kind of surprised if anything, that there wasn't a great body of work. I wonder why that is. Do you think that's just sort of the nature of sort of like limited ecumenical dialogue, or sort of not feeling the need to have it? I mean, I don't know. What do you think? I mean, if you can speculate.
Yeah. Well, yeah, from the Catholic side, there's plenty of stuff in Protestant Jewish studies,
Right.
or secular studies. I think it's right around the turn of the century, last century. Uh, I think Catholic biblical scholars started feeling like they were inferior to the German higher critics, the Protestant liberal criticism. And I think they essentially just started following their lead. And from then on, I think, there wasn't any genuine, well, I shouldn't say that, but I think, they basically punted to the Protestants. And at that time, too, there was a theory of two canons, that there was a Palestinian canon and Alexandrian canon, which seemed to make peace between Catholics and Protestants because we're like, hey, we both have Jewish canons, just different areas. But then that fell apart in the 1950s. So it was,
Mm.
uh, but in that interim, though, I think there was kind of a false peace and also an inferiority complex.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've heard that inferiority complex mentioned at various kind of iterations, and I mean, I'm grateful in one sense, to be sure, that Catholics felt inspired / convicted to kind of revisit the scriptures, right? But it's also interesting. It's something that I've wondered about, and I know we're kind of getting off topic to some extent, but this can be
Yeah,
it's
it's
all
your show.
relative.
You could do
Yeah,
whatever you want.
exactly right. So I mean, you were talking about being a research nerd, and this is exactly one of the reasons I kind of wanted an outlet, right? Is kind of an outlet to explore ideas that are interesting for me, to me,
Yeah.
right? So I already get plenty. Yeah. So anyways, I think so kind of back to that idea. Even though I know that it's sort of historically true that Catholics have had somewhat of a resurgence in terms of kind of emphasizing, at least in the apologetics kind of front, emphasizing scripture and kind of biblical scholarship, I think that that's kind of, it seems to be true. But then I've kind of also pushed back against that characterization as a convert, just because of the amount of scripture that is found liturgically, and kind of just the way that scripture has always been present in the liturgy. I don't know if that's fair. And I understand that they're not the same thing, right? I certainly respect that, biblical scholarship is kind of um, there's sort of a certain distinction there, kind of the types of studying that is being done. But sort of that whole, I don't know, it always felt like a little bit of a just sort of an unfair mischaracterization of like, the Catholics don't emphasize the Bible much. And I know that's not what you're saying, right? It just sort of
Right.
made me think about it. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, there's a difference between the popular level and the academic level.
Mm,
And popular level, I think, has always been pretty rich. Up until when I started in apologetics, in the 80s and 90s, that's when Catholics, it was after the 60s and the cultural revolutions, yada, yada, yada. A lot of Christians started being more touchy feely and not so much holding on to tradition. And so maybe at the popular level, it waned a little bit, but it made
mm.
a huge resurgence on both levels, popular and academic, within the 90s in the turn of the second millennium. But yeah, I think on the piety, the popular level with the liturgy, prayers, and just reading Bible, I think it's pretty healthy, except for maybe those 2 decades. You know,
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's often, I don't know, I don't want to oversimplify what's a very complicated situation, but there so often seems to be kind of reactions and then overreactions in the other direction, and then I guess in this case, sort of a healthy reaction, perhaps to an
yeah,
overreaction.
yeah,
But it's an interesting thing to kind of be at this point historically, and maybe that's sort of one of the blessings. It's easy for me to deride certain aspects of digital technology, despite the fact that I use it, right? I work in it and use
yeah.
it, but I still like to kind of criticize it. But at the same time, I wonder there does seem to be sort of a certain new level of access to sort of Catholic thought of all ages and of all types that almost
Mhm.
kind of makes our case. It's not that it actually makes our case more impressive than it is, but it makes our case appear as impressive as it actually is. Perhaps is a better way to say. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Right.
But just because of the ubiquitous access to information, right? Made prominent by
Yeah,
the internet. It's kind of hard to say that like Catholic fathers didn't care about scripture, and you're like, well, that one was quoting it there. There's like all
yeah,
the sermons on. I
right.
don't know. I know I'm being a little like I don't know, like I'm being a little cheeky about it, but I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it definitely made it more robust. And the fact is, with modern technology, I mean, even researching for this book, if I had done this maybe 20 years ago or even 10 years ago,
Hmm.
I would have had to travel downtown to a seminary library, go through the stacks of books, photocopy, where I could do the exact same, maybe even better research right here in my home in like 10 minutes,
Yeah,
if
exactly.
that, with all the
Especially with like
search engines
Verbum
and
and stuff,
sites.
right? And like all
Yeah,
these crazy
right.
software. Sorry to cut you off, but yeah, absolutely.
No, yeah, yeah. So, yeah, and it's rocked the apologetic world. I mean, there, especially for groups like Mormons, Jehovah Witnesses, that uh, a lot of their past history and theological development was kind of hidden. Now it's easy to double check and verify things where before you couldn't. It's also easier for people to pull the wool over other people's eyes because there's so much information out there. You can pull out little factoids that maybe some people might have difficulty verifying, or maybe just don't understand the context, you know?
No, absolutely right. So I mean, it's interesting. I wonder now, and maybe we won't have seen the full effects of this, right? As is often the case, right? When you're kind of in the midst of change and kind of revolution, or in a digital sense, um,
Mhm.
it's kind of hard to know what the full the full impact will be, right? When you're kind of in the middle of it. But I do wonder kind of what the kind of the ultimate impact will be on. Or many impacts, perhaps, on evangelization and apologetics, because, and this is kind of maybe in some ways a way to kind of tie us back to your book and the topic, because it does seem to be that skepticism is something that is almost I mean, it's definitely in fashion. I mean, it just sort of happens in like different degrees. I mean, and I think we kind of see it obviously in secular circles we see it, but then of course we also see it, I think, within Christendom more broadly speaking, and even within Catholicism, I think, in Orthodoxy, although I think it's maybe less prominent there. But it's interesting to me to kind of have that reality of kind of what seems to be um, a high degree of skepticism kind of in the world and kind of among kind of the common person, so to speak. And yet we have all this access to information. Like seemingly we have kind of more ways to point to the objective, more ways to point to what is true than ever before. And yet credibility, I think, is often what kind of comes back. In terms of like what then is in dispute. It's like, oh yeah, well then we start throwing different facts, like kind of almost contradictory facts, and it becomes this sort of a war of that. But I think what it often kind of comes down to is like a matter of credibility, right? Like, why should I believe that that's true? You know, like you say that, but why? Or you know, you were taught that by your parents, but why? And I think that's true, kind of both in a philosophical sense, kind of existential sense in many ways, but also. You know, I think in particular with Christianity and the kind of the claims of Christianity. And yeah, before we kind of dive into the specifics of your book and the gospel narrative, I mean, what would you kind of say to people who are wrestling with that, who are kind of almost either people who are resting in skepticism, perhaps, or people who don't want to be skeptical, but you know, don't really see any option just because of what seems to be just a wide variety, a disparity of differing beliefs. It's like, how do I even move forward? I don't know. I know I'm kind of putting you on the
Yeah.
spot there, but yeah, what do you say to that? Someone like that, I wonder about
Yeah.
this a lot.
Yeah, skepticism is good, and I think believing Catholics should be the most skeptical of all. You know,
Hmm.
because let's take miracle claims. As a Catholic, I want to make sure that there isn't some sort of fraud or hoax or something being passed off as genuine, because that would be, we worship the truth, and it would be contrary to Him whom we worship, right? The truth. But on the other hand, I'm also a skeptic when it comes to people debunking miracles, because I know that there are people that can, you know, uh, play around with the evidence. They could do some interpretation, or they just not, um, they're just not open to the truth, and they're just coming up with reasons not to
Hmm.
really investigate it. So, I think that's a good, healthy, like double skepticism, both for and against. It prevents us from accepting anything, credulity. And I think today a lot of people mix up skepticism with incredulity,
Hmm.
right? That those are not the same thing, right? You can be skeptical of something, but still be open to the possibility of the contrary, whatever is being argued. But incredulity is a disbelief, a positive stance that this cannot be true, and that can sometimes look as if it's healthy skepticism, when
Hmm.
actually you're just masking your own biases.
Yeah, that's a really interesting distinction. Healthy skepticism. You know, what is it? You know, not, you know, being skeptical by itself is maybe more neutral, perhaps, is what I'm hearing. But
Yeah,
how
I
you're
think so.
skeptical and to what extent, is that kind of where the line is?
Yeah, I mean, you have to avoid the, credulity and incredulity. Those are
Mm.
the two extremes you want to avoid. And I think for somebody who's open minded and really wants to follow what's true, you kind of have to strike a middle, and hear both sides and weigh the evidence, and think critically too, right?
Absolutely. No, I'm really glad you said that. So maybe if you could unravel that a little bit more for us, why do you kind of recommend some caution when it comes to kind of overdoing the credulity side? I mean, we talked about kind of why you might want to avoid incredulity, but why might you want to avoid the other extreme, particularly as a Catholic or Christian?
Yeah, well, especially today, because there's so much data out there, and so many different avenues to get data.
Mm.
Uh, you could be credulous in that you have bias confirmation, that you
Hmm.
want something to be true, so you'll only look at, seriously at things that confirm your beliefs, and you either don't listen or don't care about anything that may speak contrary, right? I think that's something a lot of people fall into. Um, and you kind of do have to filter, what you view. You just can't view everything. But on the other hand, then incredulity is the exact opposite. It also has bias confirmation, right? Confirmation bias. But in the opposite, it's you want to confirm whatever your disbelief is. And in that sense, people will actually rule out the possibility of the contrary, and which means that you're never really going to look at the evidence carefully, right? Because if you absolutely believe it's impossible. Let's take something that you think is utterly ludicrous, like the Earth is a cube, okay, which no one believes, and it's ludicrous. If that's the position that you're arguing against, you're not really going to look carefully at the arguments that it's a cube, right? You're just going to glance over it and just say that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous, right? So, both incredulity and credulity, like, uh, it doesn't do justice to the evidence. I think that's basically the bottom line. You know.
I know. I think that's really helpful because I think perhaps too often I can definitely include myself in this, especially maybe my younger self. How's that for distancing myself from the comment? But I definitely think that I was quick as a younger Christian, kind of raised in the evangelical tradition, to kind of jump on skepticism, but very much from the stance of credulity, kind of from the other extreme stance. Kind of like how couldn't you believe? Kind of that more almost. Almost a triumphalist kind of view of it, but it also is a kind of a naive view, I think, and it's something that frustrates me quite a bit online. Anytime, and I find myself being that kind of annoying person who will defend an atheist if they're kind of being wrongly maligned. Where I'm like, well, I mean, come on, there's actually better arguments for atheism than that. I mean, they're still wrong because of this, and this, but just so often there's this kind of like, oh, we're like triumphalist Christians, and like, how could you possibly ever come to the conclusion that the Christian God isn't the God? And you see that kind of, right. And now I of course have come to that conclusion and very much strongly believe it, and I think there's great reasons for it. But interesting enough, the reason I think it frustrates me so much to see people do that, to kind of respond that way, is it actually makes it less credible. It's sort of an irony in it, right? Kind of by taking that stance, and not allowing that room for healthy skepticism, as it were, you actually kind of erode the credibility of your own movement, even if it is indeed the truth. And that's something that I often think about being in marketing. I often think about that in terms of our presentation as evangelists, as apologists, right? Like, I mean, if we do the content that we're presenting a great disservice by the way we're presenting it, I mean, maybe it is our fault in a sense, right? Like there certainly is like, like maybe it is our fault that it's not received well, or whatever kind of that negative result is. And I think the positive iteration of that is just to make sure that we're mindful of our presentation as well as the content, which is not a controversial stance whatsoever. But and yet we see so many YouTube channels that grow almost exactly because of that, of kind of that.
Yeah.
Feeding the fire mentality. So I don't know. It's interesting. But zooming in a little bit more on your book, because this does seem to connect to that, right? Kind of what is credible? Like why can we believe? Why should we
Mhm.
believe the Gospels are credible? So can you just tell us a little bit about the new book, and just kind of give us a synopsis, if you would?
Yeah, I what I wanted to do was take a person from just maybe not even maybe they heard about Jesus, don't really know who he is or why he's important. Because first you got to explain why is it important to read the book, right? So I start off the book with a quick apology on or defense of why Jesus is important, and I
Mm,
just want to get the reader to say, "Huh," you know. It's like, yeah, there is something weird, this Jesus of Nazareth, and yeah, I want to look into it. And then what I do is I move from there to did Jesus use any, is this could this just be a hoax or a legend,
mm,
that was popular back in the late 1800s, where this is just a legend or myth that circulates, lore, that circulates within a group, and it gets expanded and distorted, and there's really no there might be a tiny kernel of truth, but it's all legend.
mm,
So I look to see, okay, just looking at the Gospels and looking at what we know about the historic context, did Jesus plug himself into a culture and use that culture to transmit his teachings and his deeds accurately? And I show that he does, because the Jewish culture had this rabbi disciple mechanism to do that. And I show how Jesus kind of amps that up to the nth degree. And then the next question is, okay, so there was there is this mechanism by which we can learn about Jesus. The Gospels show us evidence that he used it. Uh, is there any evidence in the Gospels of an effort to accurately record Jesus' words?
Mm.
And what I show there is in a couple of chapters, I show there's multiple layers of mnemonic encryption or format. That's it. That the Gospels show these formatting layers that are to help for accurate recall of information. And so that's a fun one. And there's also some mysterious stuff going on too. You know, um, you want me to give you a for instance?
I would love one. Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely.
yeah. So the earliest manuscripts we have of the Gospels are in Greek. Okay,
Hmm.
so there's a Greek Greek speaking Jews to a Greek audience, right? And what we do is, if you're a Greek and you're reading these Greek scriptures, you find out something weird that a lot of times the Gospels speak not Greek, but they speak like Aramaic or Hebrew in the Greek language. Okay. So it's like in English, it'd be like I would talk to you with my Midwest accent right now. Then all of a sudden I switch to, a New Orleans accent or Deep South accent, right? And it's like I'm still speaking English, but people in the Midwest don't speak English like that. I start saying
Right.
y'all and stuff like that, right? So it's
Absolutely.
kind of the same way. So scholars have, and this is not controversial. This is some scholars have known for well over a century. Is there appears in the Gospels that what we have today was using some pre-canonical material that was either Hebrew or Aramaic. So there's actually material even closer to the time of Jesus that the Gospels use, closer than the actual Gospels we have. Okay. Now, what's cool is that's fascinating enough. Like, why would you do that if you're doing a hoax, right? Why would you go
It's an
through?
elaborate hoax, if that, right?
Yeah, well, hold on. It's going to get a lot more elaborate. Okay. So when you start looking at that and try to back translate what's in the Greek into a possible Hebrew or Aramaic text, uh, by and large, that's kind of a fool's errand, right? Because translating one language to another, you have multiple choices of words. But there are instances where there's word plays or other things that stick out that you're pretty sure what the Hebrew or Aramaic says. Okay, makes sense.
It does. Yeah.
Okay, now here's a prayer all Christians should be familiar with. It's called the Benedictus, and it's Zechariah's song of praise, right, with John, and very familiar. Catholics pray the Benedictus, and this is a great example. There's three lines in the Benedictus that we read, and it doesn't. There's nothing important about it, right? Like it says, to perform mercy promised to our fathers, to remember His holy covenant, the oath in which He swore to our father Abraham. Okay, nothing peculiar, right?
No, not
Nothing.
especially.
And the same thing's in Greek. You read it in Greek, it reads pretty much the same way, right? But when you look at it with an eye to Aramaic or Hebrew, you find something really weird going on. Okay. For example, uh, the root word, Hebrew has a root word and then it builds on it. So you can have different words using the same root. The root word for to show mercy is Hanan in Hebrew. Okay. Hanan's also the same root word for the name John, Yohanan.
Mm. Okay.
Okay. And then to remember is Holy Covenant. The word in Hebrew is zakar, which is the same root as Zachariah. You can even hear zakar in there, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And then to swear an oath in Hebrew is Shabbat, which is the same root as Elishaba, Elizabeth. So in these three lines, you have the root to the three names, John, Zechariah, and Elizabeth.
That's fascinating. And we would never
Yeah,
catch it in English.
never catch it, right? And you wouldn't catch it in Greek either. It's buried under the Greek. And
Mm.
it's like, okay, why did he want to mention the roots of these three names? Well, I think it's obvious. It's a memory device, right? So if you're trying to remember this song, all you have to remember is the three progenitors, right? John, Zechariah, Elizabeth. You got to show mercy. to remember, to swear an oath. You got pretty much the 3 lines right there.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, no, I mean it is helpful. I mean, I might remember it just after hearing it from you now. I mean,
Yeah,
which is
right.
fascinating. Yeah, right. That's
Yeah.
really an interesting
So if
concept.
you're
That
doing a
happens in a lot of
hoax,
places, right? Like that keeps happening.
right? If you're doing a hoax, this is like over engineered to the nth degree, right? I mean, this is crazy over engineering. Because why would you make it seem as if there's these memory devices and then hide them,
Mm,
right? So
mm.
so even the original readers probably wouldn't pick it up. And so I go through. I show like some of the stuff in Hebrew. I also show there's like maybe 6 or 7 different layers of formatting for memory, uh, and so that's really cool. I go through that, and then I bring up the next big question, which is okay, fine. There seems to be a concerted effort to accurately pass on what Jesus said and did. So how do we know that this actually happened, right?
Mm.
How do we know that this isn't an embellishment or exaggeration? How do we know the Gospels are true, right? So then I do some thought experiments, and which is real fun because it's kind of like a detective, thing. It's like, if what kind of evidence would convince me that a miracle took place in a basement between 2 people, right? That would be pretty tough to prove because it could be hoaxed really, really easy. Then you
Absolutely.
then you kind of take it out of the basement, or you add people to the basement. Okay, it's a little easier now. You can verify some stuff. It still could be a fraud. Take them out of the basement, different locations. You could add all these different layers. Unstaged audiences. You can have skeptics that it's in their best interest to debunk. And then I show the Gospels do the same thing, right? Jesus does miracles, multiple locations, unstaged audiences, small audiences, large ones. We go through all of that. And then the other thing I do is I show that the Gospels write pretty big checks.
How
And
so?
yeah, well, when you go to the bank and you have a check for $5 or $10, right? They just run it through. They give you the money, no problem, right?
Sure,
But
sure.
if you have a check for like $1 million, you can't do that through the drive-through,
Mm,
right? You got to
I
go.
see.
They got to call. They got to verify. They make sure it's you. They got to make sure the funds are there. Why? Because $5 or $10, they could take a hit if it's a fraud. But $1 million, that's a big risk. So they're going to check it out to make sure it's going to pass, right? And when you look at the Gospels in that light, what you see is the Gospels write huge checks, and a lot of them,
Mm,
right? All these miracles and claims that Jesus is God and so on. Excuse me. So, the first Christians, therefore, had enormous risk, you know,
mm,
and would they verify this information? And so what I do is I show, yeah, there definitely would be many reasons why they would verify it, like they could be kicked out of their family, kicked out of the synagogue, or even be persecuted, killed, that type of thing. But even so, if you follow a false Messiah, you're going to be damned to hell if you're a believing Jew. So you would definitely check it out, right? You wouldn't just say, "Hey, this guy seems pretty cool. I'll follow him," right?
No,
Which is very
you're absolutely
different.
right. The
Yeah,
stakes were incredibly high. I mean, higher than they've ever been in history. I mean, like at least consistently higher, during the first several hundred years than they've ever been
yeah,
afterwards. Except for in isolated instances. Of course, there are certain countries even today where there are martyrs and things like that. But yeah, the stakes were incredibly high. That's a really fascinating concept. I think you're right. Like, of course, people would have taken notice. I mean, these were not small claims; they were kind of quite outlandish claims. And furthermore, people were taking these claims seriously and then doing crazy things, so to speak, as a result of such claims. So like there was kind of like multiple layers of flags, so to speak, that would demand skeptics' attention. So that's an interesting thought. So I know, like nowadays, looking back, it's maybe easy to sweep under the rug, like, oh, it was just mass. I don't know what people say. Mass hysteria, I think, is one of the things. I mean, I've heard kind of various iterations of that, like, but it's very hard to really apply that when you start looking at the isolated scenes and instances and developments in multiple locations, right? And the way it spread, especially as the apostles went out and then their various followers spread and became, when you start thinking about
yeah.
how it actually happened, it's hard to paint such broad strokes. Um, So what might you say to kind of the more I don't know, maybe the more gracious skeptic who's kind of like, yeah, no, something happened. He definitely inspired people to follow him, but some of his claims were just too much. I mean, kind of, do you address the resurrection and some of
Yeah,
the other
no,
kind of yeah.
yeah, no, I don't have an apology specifically for that. I'm
Mm,
focused only on just vindicating the Gospels. Um, but something along those lines is when you read the Gospels with an eye now for did they verify it, right? Because if no one verified it, it could just be a total exaggeration, hoax, whatever, right? So what you do is if as you're reading the Gospels, you find strange things pop up,
mm.
and it's almost like the Gospels are daring people to verify. I call it the dare to verify thing. It's almost a double dog dare. Let me give you a text.
I love A Christmas Story. I have a shirt for it. I should have worn it to the
Yeah, the
interview.
double
So.
dog dare, right? And the
Triple dog
Gospels
dare.
do this a lot. My favorite one is in the Bread of Life discourse in John 6. Okay.
Mm,
Because we're all familiar with it, but I bet there's a line there you might not have noticed, but it always bugged me though. Jesus is saying, "You must eat my flesh and drink my blood. Eat my flesh and drink my blood. You have no life within you. So on and so forth." And this is the only discourse Jesus gives where he actually loses his own followers, right? It's not the Jews,
mm.
but the followers of Jesus. Many of them leave because of this teaching. And, it's funny, you're reading it. Jesus says all these things. The very next line, the narrator jumps in. And it's almost like those old TV broadcasts. I don't know if you're old enough to remember, but whenever there's breaking news, right? You're watching Gilligan's Island and something happens and they break in. We interrupt this program to give you a very important news update.
I do. As a child, it was still that way. Yeah, when I was
Yeah,
a young kid watching TV, it was like that. Yeah.
yeah. So you're reading John 6. Jesus is saying this, and it's always during the part of the program that you don't want to miss. That's
Oh,
when the news
always.
break. Well, it's the same here. He says these incredible things. All of a sudden, the narrator jumps in just out of nowhere, and he says, "Jesus said these things while he was teaching in the synagogue of Capernaum. Now back to your regularly scheduled program." Right, and then it just continues like nothing happened. Right. So biblical scholars thought, well, maybe this is two discourses stitched together, and this is the ending of one or whatever. But I think there's a much better explanation. It's like after Jesus says this stuff, which even his own followers left,
Hmm.
the narrator knew this is something that the reader probably wouldn't accept, right? So he felt the need to jump in and give specifically where this happened and who was there when he said this. Why? Because it's a double dog dare. It's like, if you don't believe what we just said, go to Capernaum and ask the people in the synagogue, and they heard it, you know? Check it out for yourself,
I
and then
love
back to
that.
the regularly scheduled program.
Yeah, I mean, it's good journalism, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
It's
you're
like,
like you're citing a source, and you have like you're adding some extra information. So if someone wants to go verify, they actually can. You're giving them,
yeah, exactly.
that's
Yeah, and
fantastic.
and the
Yeah.
and the Gospels are very specific too. I mean, it would be very easy to verify Jesus did these things. They say where, in front of who. Sometimes they even give individuals or institutions like the Pharisees or something or the Sanhedrin. Uh, all that data. If you were in the first century, and of course it would be incumbent upon you if you care about your life and your livelihood to
Yeah.
check it out. You certainly could. And even at the beginning of Luke's gospel, Luke starts off saying that he investigated everything accurately and knew, so that Theophilus in his catechesis would know for certain, what happened. So we know this verification process happened.
No, that's so interesting. I know we're kind of talking around exactly this, but I mean, kind of, can you talk a little bit more about what inspired you to write this? I mean, kind of, what are you hoping people kind of take away from your book? From what we're talking about.
Yeah, well, it's all my books are usually like when I get so much data and I'm afraid I'm going to start forgetting stuff, I put it in a book so I can remember.
You got to write it down. We got to
Yeah,
have a
so
record, right?
yeah, so this is like the product of who knows how long,
Mhm.
just stumbling across all these interesting things. And I think part of the incentive is there are some excellent books trying to vindicate the Gospels from an evangelical perspective out there.
Mm.
Okay, and they do a very good job vindicating the text, the textual integrity, that our text is identical or nearly identical to the original. And they do a pretty good job with the veracity or truthfulness of the text. But they're limited, though. And this is really interesting, Noah. They're limited because they can't cross a red line of sacred tradition, right?
Mm, mm,
And because once you do that, now you're giving credence to sacred tradition, which Sola Scriptura people don't, methodologically exclude, right? So, so they can only vindicate the gospel so far, and what happens is they only vindicate the text, but it's kind of thin,
mm,
Um, they don't ask the further questions. Let me give you an example because this will actually explain the rest of my book. Okay. For example, and I've seen atheists bring this up. I always thought I think this is a good criticism. They would say, fine, even if you can show me that your text today is identical to the original or nearly identical. And even if you could say that it's generally truthful, the uh, geography squares, history squares, stuff like that. It doesn't matter because ultimately, whose interpretation of the text is legit,
mm.
right? Because anyone can approach a text and come up with diametrically opposed interpretations. So it's the whole project, even if it was successful, fails at the end, right?
Mm. Yeah.
And that's a good criticism. There was a book. Sorry if I'm going on and on,
Oh,
but
please! I love this. This is great. I'm
yeah,
very interested. So please continue. Yeah.
yeah. There's a book, and I always forget the author's name. It was written, I think, around 60 to 70 years after the Protestant Reformation.
Mhm.
It's called 200 Interpretations of the Word, This Is My Body. And the whole book is nothing but a list of various interpretations of those words, right?
Mm.
So it's like, yeah, that's a really good question. What's the meaning of the text? And what about the canon? How do you know which books belong in the Bible? And those are areas where I think Protestant scholarship gets very thin, right? But if you take the early church seriously and you see it as an ongoing community that goes throughout history, those are easy questions to answer because the same method you use to vindicate the truthfulness or the integrity of the text, that our text is identical to the original, that same method can also be applied to the canon, to the meaning of a text. It could be applied to all sorts of very important ideas, and that's because it's based on tradition, sacred tradition that goes alongside with written tradition, and that's
Yeah.
what I do with the rest of the book.
No, it's just really interesting. Well, something you just said a minute back was it's just kind of still resonating with me. Kind of the Protestant defense is missing a few weapons, so to speak, or the
Yeah,
sort of lines that they won't cross or can't cross. And it's really interesting. Yeah. The real
yeah, and
presence in particular
go
seems to
ahead.
be kind of something that yeah, I mean, even for a sola scriptura person, I definitely, I would think there's lots of reason to believe in the real presence, but that's kind of a side step, just kind of. But now that I'm thinking about John 6, it's kind of hard not to think about that, right? Because of what you were saying, right? I mean, there was so many like, "Hey, call me on my bluff," and people did and left, and he still doubled down on it. But what I'm kind of hearing is kind of in some sense that's what the entire Gospels are doing, right? They're kind of like,
Yeah,
"Hey, like." Call my bluff, and they're sort of double
yeah.
downing on the claim. And I mean, not just double downing, right? I mean, there's four gospels that are complementary. Yeah, I don't. Maybe were you about to say something else? I was gonna. Now I think maybe I'm gonna steer the direction. 'Cause I was curious about
Oh, no, no,
the
no. Go
four
ahead.
gospels,
No,
but
that's fine.
if there was
Yeah.
something else you were gonna say, like please,
Yeah, I
please.
was just going to say there are scholars now that are starting to use the early church,
Mm,
but they have to be very careful, about
yeah.
what kind of data they take, and it usually is like the earliest early church.
It's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, no, actually, Doctor Gavin Ortland came to mind because he recently put out a video. He's a Reformed Baptist, I believe, and he put out a video kind of why Protestants should embrace the real presence, which I thought was really interesting. And it was a very biblical and historical case, which is very rational, right? And I think that in many ways you almost don't need tradition in that particular instance, and yet the lack of tradition definitely seems connected to an abandonment of the real presence doctrine. So there's definitely a correlation there. So I always want to embrace, I'm always want to celebrate when a Protestant kind of returns to, Orthodox tradition. That's a great thing, right? Whether they become Catholic or not, because it's one step closer to actual true ecumenical unity, right? We have to first sort of retain orthodoxy on all sides. I mean, there's never going to be
Right.
like a real lasting unity unless orthodoxy is maintained. So in some sense, us being like, oh, become Catholic is almost less helpful than being like, okay, let's all work together to like regain orthodoxy. Now, of course, we as Catholics believe that we're in a different position when we're saying that than the Protestants. But I don't know. It's interesting. I know I'm getting myself sidetracked, but it's making me think of all sorts of interesting thoughts.
Yeah, that's good. That's why I love talking to you. It's same
Oh
here.
well,
It's just, interesting
likewise.
roads. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
So,
likewise. So what about the
yeah.
four gospels, right? There's four gospels. I haven't given this much thought. So some of these questions I'm kind of like just sort of exploring myself, for the first time live with you. But the four gospels would seemingly be a good way to kind of double, triple, quadruple down, right? On what's being said, right? Kind of like
Mhm.
multiple testaments to that, multiple testimonies, which would make it more reliable. But I know also that some critics maybe point out discrepancies and kind of use that maybe to kind of try to pick apart some of the credibility of the kind of the larger gospel narrative. Can you talk a little bit about just sort of I don't know, the relationship about the four kind of like how they, I don't know, how they complement each other, contrast each other?
Yeah. Well, as far as we can trace it, there was four and only four gospels that were accepted or received in the early church. So, which is unusual, right? I mean, it seems pretty chiseled that it's only these four. Yeah, I bring up some studies by boy, now I can't remember her name. Has to do with there's incidental coincidences that occur amongst the four gospels and Acts too, where the gospel writers will assume certain things, or and you don't know about those things, and the other ones will be explicit, but it'd always be not on purpose. It'd be incidental, right?
Hmm.
I don't know if that makes sense. For example, um, now let's see if make sure I get this right. I'm like you, my brain power begins to fade later in the day.
Oh man,
Uh,
so we're gonna have some real speculative theology here for the rest. We'll just put an
yeah.
asterisk by
So
the rest of the conversation.
Linda McGrew, and that's her name, Linda McGrew,
Linda McGrew. I'm
and
gonna take
yeah,
notes here.
unintended coincidences or something to that effect. And there's a ton of them. For example, one of the things that stick out in my mind, it may not be the strongest one, but we know in one gospel that Jesus does the multiplication of loaves during Passover season. Another gospel gives this little incidental detail that there was a lot of green grass in that particular area where the miracle happened.
Hmm.
So it's like, okay, that in itself doesn't seem that peculiar, except remember, Judea is a very arid place. It's rare that it's ever green, right? So if you're going to have green grass, it has to be during the rainy season in the spring,
Hmm.
which just so happens to jive with the Feast of Passover, right? So you have these two gospels essentially collating to the same point, but with these like little offhanded comments that were never intended to, coalesce or to work together. There's no collusion going on
That's
between them.
interesting. So they complement each other almost. They complement one another better in a sense because of the lack of intention behind them. They're just sort of they're
Yeah,
accidental, incidental. I like yeah, like
exactly.
it's hidden. I believe hidden in plain view.
Yeah,
Undesigned coincidences in the Gospels and Acts by Lydia McGrew. Just in case
yeah,
anyone else is following along, I was googling. I think that's the one you're talking
yeah.
about.
Thanks. That is the one. Yep.
Okay, yeah, I'm
Yeah, fascinating stuff. It's
yeah. Oh, I'm
how
sorry.
do you get that?
Undesigned coincidences. I misread
Okay.
it, man. Yeah. It's only 6:50. I don't know what my excuse is. I told you it was after 9, but really I'm after 6:30.
Yeah,
So,
it's good, and she's basing it actually on the older work that laid down the groundwork, and she expands on it.
hmm.
And you have this between Acts and the Gospels in themselves. And what it is, it's the flip side of the Bible difficulty argument, right? The Gospels are false because they contradict one another.
Hmm.
This is the flip side. It's the Gospels are true because they accidentally confirm each other. So you have to balance it. It's like, yeah, there are difficulties, but there are these. coincidences too that couldn't possibly have been through collusion. And I think with the difficulties too, there's another good book, Cold Case Christianity, that was out. It's by evangelical. Yeah, you could maybe look it up really quick.
I can't help myself. I'm a
Interesting book.
researcher.
Yeah, he's a detective, I believe. His story is that he was an unbeliever,
Mm,
and he specialized in eyewitness testimony. And when he read the Gospels, like they rang true to him, not because of the message, but because of his work in investigative, uh, police investigations. And he makes a point that you never have a legitimate case where everything jives perfectly.
mm.
Whenever there's eyewitness testimony to events, there will always be discrepancies, and sometimes some big discrepancies. But that doesn't mean it's false. It actually means that, yeah, they didn't collude on this. This is independent witnesses. And so that could explain things like why somebody sees one angel where another person says two or more angels, that type of thing. That fits in with eyewitness testimony.
It's really interesting. I can't help but go back to kind of the framework, and maybe that's a helpful framework for this entire conversation. Just is that back to the credulity versus incredulity, and kind of those, avoiding both extremes, because it
Yeah.
seems that the Gospels kind of could easily slip into, one's interpretation of the Gospels could easily slip into error in a sense if we favored either side of it, right? I mean, I imagine there's kind of, fundamentalists on sort of certain evangelical trends that might kind of favor credulity too much in certain scriptural passages. Maybe not the Gospels particularly. Maybe I'm thinking now more of Genesis or genre specific type situations. But
Right.
it does seem that there's a healthy skepticism that's needed in the middle, right, to actually understand it. It's like if you kind of want to disbelieve, you can find reasons to support your disbelief. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say. But if you want to believe, then you can find reasons to support. So then the real, the real open-minded investigator, you need to have a healthy skepticism, and then I think compare the weight of the pros and the cons, right, and almost do more of a probabilistic case. Or at least that's how I would approach it. Is that a fair
Yeah, sure.
way? I don't want to mislead people. That's how I
Yeah,
would do it, though, right?
yeah, it's definitely cumulative, right?
Yeah,
I mean, there's
cumulative.
all these different things that stack on one another. Yeah, and then for me, and I start the book off with setting up Jesus of Nazareth. There has to be some sort of sufficient reason why why there's this ongoing observable miracle that is currently here today. It's observed around the world, and it's missed by pretty much everybody. And that is the church. The Catholic Church exists today, 2,000 years, no explanation why, had everything against it, including lots of wicked members, and yet it's still here, right? And to
Yeah.
kick it off, you have this ancient prophecy of this person coming out of Judea who will rule the whole inhabited earth, in the first century. And who is that? And why is it the church says Jesus of Nazareth is?
Yeah.
It's like, I think there, even before you even look at the evidence, you have to say there has to be some sort of sufficient reason how to understand this. Why, you have a worldwide religion that's persisted for 2,000 years against all odds, against all persecutions, based on this rabbi in the first century that should have just disappeared without anybody even remembering his name.
Absolutely, that's given me pause myself. I mean, or so I should say, it gave me pause when I wasn't a practicing Christian, when I was kind of struggling with kind of, that. I think that did give me pause, and I think that your mention of the cumulative case is really important here. I think that,
Yeah.
I mean, put simply, I'm a Christian and I'm a Catholic because of the cumulative case for Catholic Christianity, not because of these isolated arguments, kind of in these little bubbles. And I don't want to speak for you, but I think that it's important to always remember that, because I think sometimes we almost we zoom too far in on like one thing or the other. And I think that could work in the micro topical sense of like what we're talking about with the Gospels, and I could work just kind of in the broader sense of Catholicism at large. Where I think it's easy for critics to pick up, maybe put another way, it's easy for critics to pick apart little isolated things, and you can get really distracted, and there's lots of confusion that can be created
Yeah.
when we zoom too far in, and then we kind of forget sometimes the weight and the strength of the cumulative case. At least I think for people like us who are trying to remain, trying to maintain that healthy skepticism, trying not to just create our own echo chambers, even if they're better echo chambers in our minds, right? We still don't want to create
Yeah.
them, right? We want to kind of continue to kind of examine and re-examine, and maybe that's something I wanted to ask you about is like, how do we how do we treat uncertainty when it comes to these types of things? Is there sort of a certain amount of uncertainty with respect to the gospel narrative that's permitted, and if so, like, in what sense does it apply? Because certainly there are certain things the Catholic Church teaches undeniably that occurred, historical truths. And then
Mhm.
sometimes, there's obviously there's parables, which are a different type of subgenre. And I'm just sort of curious, like, but what amount of like uncertainty is kind of like expected, perhaps, when it comes to kind of approaching the Gospels in our modern world? Do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think ultimately uh, you need humility, you
Mm,
know. And I'm saying for non-believers and believers, I think you fall into credulity or you fall into incredulity when you're not humble and you think you have all the information and all your ducks are in a row, you know. And that's just not possible. And I mean, no endeavor in life is do we know everything about everything, right? There's always facts of history missing. There is always weird quirks in history, that type of thing. Um, so you have to, be very careful with the evidence, not to say, "Gee, there's no solution here, so there can never be a solution,"
mm,
right? And I think that's really easy for somebody to be incredulous and say, "Oh, I don't see a solution. I don't see any possible solution. So there is no solution," right?
mm,
Which, of course, is, uh, which is a wrong answer. You should say it's most likely there's no solution. I don't know if that helps, but there's always areas of human knowledge in which there is going to be uncertainty because we just don't know everything. But that's when it's always good to zoom out and look at the big picture, I
mm.
think.
Yeah.
Because when you're in the weeds, there's missing data, there's strange data, maybe something's altered or whatever. But when you look at the big picture, you have to come up with some sort of coherent explanation for it all.
Mm,
Could this really happen? And I think that's another strength that hopefully comes through in the book is all of this is common sense. The stuff that I lay out in my book. I don't know. Do you know Pat Flynn? He has a great channel
I know the
called
name, but I
Philosophy
not
for
I don't know
People.
exactly why. I've probably stumbled upon his content, but I don't know it very well.
Yeah, he's an atheist. He became Catholic, a studied atheist. Brilliant guy.
Oh, he's on Catholic Answers, or he's a contributor there.
Yeah, he's a
I've
convert
probably seen one of
and
his essays at some point then. But yeah, what's that's really interesting. I don't know
real,
much about
really
his
cool
story
guy.
though.
Yeah. He was an atheist. Like I said, studied atheist. You realize that atheism philosophically had huge problems that couldn't be
Mm,
insurmounted. And but he liked Aristotle, and through Aristotle he came into Aquinas, and then he became Catholic, or I think either that or he back to Catholic. I can't remember. Fascinating story. But the reason I bring it up was I was on his channel, and he was saying, my 9 year old asked, Dad, how do we know this stuff's true? The Gospels and that. And so he said, well, how would you explain to a 9 year old, yeah, why we believe it to be true?
yeah.
And in my book, I give an exercise that it's like if you just walk through this little thought experiment, it's like it just makes so much sense, right? Like a 9 year old would see, yeah, this is how the world looks. So I use it to investigate, like, could you verify? How you would you verify? Would it make a difference if it's the first century, second, third, fourth? Um, and yeah, good stuff.
No, that's great.
But it's very simple, very commonsensical.
That's great. So, just one of the comments we just got, Haley, one of our apologists across the Tiber, just said that she's definitely shared some of Pat Flynn's stuff. So that's why.
Oh
So I
yeah,
definitely have. I'm not just making it up. I've definitely read his stuff. I'm terrible with the name and placement, right? I'll read all these articles and then I won't really pay much attention to the author, which is not a really great thing to do, especially as someone who enjoys writing. It's actually kind
right.
of shameful, right? I should give them more credit, but read all these great articles and then just forget who
Yeah,
writes them.
becomes a
So
blur. Yeah, I know.
it
Yeah,
does, but
great
that's
channel.
so that makes me wonder. So I mean, I just we were talking about this a little bit offline, but I mean, I think many people that I know, people that were raised Christian, people that are still Christian, whether kind of mostly I'm talking, I guess, kind of non-Catholic Christians here, as
Mhm.
well as atheists and agnostics. I feel like skepticism is something that's become, I don't know, it's almost become a comfort zone to kind of rest in to various degrees. So certainly we've talked about the sort of the healthy skepticism. What might you what might you say to someone who is wanting to be in that middle zone, wanting to be a healthy skeptic, not wanting to kind of veer too far to either extreme, but is still struggling to buy into the Christ narrative, if I can reduce it to that. Um,
Okay.
what would you like? What would you kind of say? What kind of be your entry conversation or your entry point, or where might you point them? I'm just sort of curious, kind of how would you kind of approach that?
Yeah, that's what I
Someone of good
give them
faith, right?
copy of my
Someone who
book.
genuinely wants to, right? And I
Yeah.
know. Besides,
Right.
read your book because I'm going to tell everyone to read your book, and I'm going to send put links out and all that. But
Yeah. Yeah. You know, it's important to know the force of the other person's argument.
mm,
Because if they feel it's persuasive, there has to be some sort of persuasive force behind it. And if you think Christianity is bunk and it's all fake and it's worthless, but you don't feel the force of Christian arguments for Christianity, you're not really understanding Christianity, right?
mm,
Because at least you should say, you know what, I can see where someone would believe this. I don't believe it, but I can see where that would be attractive. And I think once you get to that point where you could say, look, I don't believe, but I can understand, I can feel the force. I think that's kind of the sweet zone, that's a
yeah,
good level of skepticism. Because like lots of people are atheists and some are studied atheists. So unless you feel the force of the atheistic arguments, you don't really understand it. They have some force, right? They might be flawed somewhere,
sure,
but yeah,
absolutely,
yeah. And I tried to do that for all my studies, like Jehovah Witnesses, Mormons, whatever, because they buy into it. If I want to really refute it, I have to feel the force of their arguments. And like I said, for vindicating the Gospels, there's lots of really great books that take certain approaches. And if for someone who maybe is struggling with it, I would say look at all the different approaches before you start looking at detractors and see whether they're able to answer them or not. I don't know if that helps, but for me, that's where the sweet zone is.
I know. I think it does, and I think that you kind of hit maybe the nail on the head with the kind of the attractive, kind of like the attraction comment. There's an element of attraction anytime the truth is presented well. And
Mhm.
I think that even if people don't fully buy into it, even if they sort of question some of the underlying assumptions, premises, whatever, I think that there is. I think that's something you can work with, at least in terms of a conversation, right? You can work with that. I know that for me, I personally was attracted to the beauty of Catholicism long before I was attracted to the goodness. If we're talking about transcendentals, or let me
Mhm.
rephrase, I was attracted to the beauty of it long before I was convinced of the goodness and the truth. You know what I mean? So it was kind of,
Right. Sure.
and I think there's a beauty to truth and to the narrative, to the way that the salvation history has unraveled. But then that kind of brings us back a little bit to the kind of the myth and symbol kind of reality. And certainly in Christianity, there are, I mean, it's symbols are rampant, right, in Christianity and sort of Christian history. And Christ not only fulfills many types that are, Old Testament types, but also has many kind of, I don't know, people, what am I trying to say? It seems that people, appreciate the sort of the symbolic representation of what Christ represents. Sacrificial love. Willingness to kind of put aside yourself for another. Like there's people that often kind of are attracted to the symbol of it, but kind of don't really go beyond that symbol into the sort of the reality of Christ. The actual God
Yeah.
man who lived and breathed and was incarnate. How would you kind of like encourage someone to bridge that gap if they're attracted to the symbol, right? They're in that place, and they're not denying the reality necessarily. Maybe they are, maybe they're not, maybe they're skeptical. I don't know, but why not just stay there? Why not just stay there and kind of be content with Christ as kind of a beautiful symbol? I mean, why kind of go further? And I mean, I know many
Yeah.
reasons why, but I want to know why you would say.
Yeah. I would say because. symbols don't have causative force. Okay,
Mm.
you can have symbols. Jesus could point to certain things, but that's all it is. He just points to certain things. So he's no different from any philosopher, right? It's almost like Platonic forms. Platonic
Yeah.
forms, as Plato understood it, the problem with that is these forms that are out in the third realm, how in the world do they affect reality, right? There's no causal link
Right.
between the forms and reality, right? Well, the same thing's true with symbols. I mean, symbols are great. They make us feel good. They're healthy, but they don't have any imperative, right?
Mm.
Which is what's different from Christianity as opposed to any other uh, school of thought or belief system. Is Christianity was able to transform Western civilization, dynamically change it from paganism to where we are today, or
Hmm.
actually where we used to be, I should say, because we're rejecting the incarnation, and now we live in a post-Christian world. But
Absolutely.
where did that force come from? Where is that imperative that was incumbent upon, that pressed it on people that they must believe this is true? Symbols can't do that unless they're symbols of something that's true and real, right?
Mm.
Because
Yeah.
you die for something that's real. It's really tough to die for an idea, right?
No, that's beautiful. Yeah, I mean, a symbol has to point back to something, right? Like the symbol itself perhaps has no inherent value, right? The symbol gets its value from that which it symbolizes. I mean, in a sense.
Yeah,
And I know
right.
I'm trying to put, I'm not meaning to put words in your mouth, but that's just sort of how I'm kind of
Yeah,
like processing what you're saying. And that's maybe it's beautiful, right? So these symbols are great, but we got to maybe use them to point back to Christ or to elements of sort of reality, right? The symbols are helpful tools, perhaps, to help us
yeah,
better understand reality. But if they start to supplant reality, then we probably, I mean, I imagine some sort of disorder enters at that point. I'm not sure what exactly it would reduce us to, but maybe
yeah,
just sort of an oversimplification, maybe almost a modern Gnosticism of sorts.
yeah,
I don't know.
yeah.
I'm sort of speculating now, but
It'd be pretty much where we are today in society,
yeah. So
where
basically, what we
you
have,
are
yeah,
what you think
exactly.
you are, and it doesn't matter, any kind of reality, how things truly are. It's just whatever you want it to be, it is. Yeah, and I mean, here I'll give you a concrete example.
Yeah, please.
Modern science was birthed out of Christianity.
Mm,
Science was stillborn in every other culture. Every culture made important contributions to what becomes modern science, but it was only within the Christian West that modern science takes off as a self-sustaining enterprise. And the reason for that is actually because of the Deuterocanonical books.
really?
Yeah, the dude. Two texts in particular. One is in Second Maccabees, that God created everything ex nihilo, right,
Mhm.
from nothing, and the other one is that God. This is in the Book of Wisdom, that God had. I'm going to butcher the text, but God had uh, made things to fall into number, weight, and measure.
Mm,
Okay. In other words, these abstractions are actually part of reality. Reality is, and abstractions are like intertwined, for those who are into philosophy, you'll understand what I'm saying. If you're not, don't worry about it. But what it is so this impressed upon Catholics, since this is divine scripture, divine revelation, that these truths are so, then in the incarnation itself, that God became man. So by studying the nature, we come to understand the thought of God, or in Christ's case,
mhm,
the divinity, right? Um, that imposed an imperative on Christians to start picturing reality in this particular way. And it's really from that science starts to develop, right? Because if it isn't anchored in these things that have to be true, right? They're not philosophical schools. They're not like abstractions. The early Greeks understood extractions, but that that everything actually is ordered
mm.
and can be understood through these things. Everything, even the stuff we haven't discovered, that gets the ball rolling, right, for science. But it's only because of the imperative, right?
Absolutely.
If Christianity was just a philosophical school, we probably wouldn't have modern science today, not like it is.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and I mean that's not even to mention the fact that the church played, preeminent role in the establishment of the university system, and even the kind of like I mean, literally the way we come to know knowledge at an advanced level. We can
Yeah,
largely credit the church, and that's not me being like a rah rah Catholic. Let's just find the great. Like that's just undeniable history. I mean, the Catholic Church was the one who, developed that. It's fascinating because for me as a Protestant, excuse me, for me previously as a Protestant prior to my conversion, one of the reasons I was attracted to the truth of Catholicism long before, probably 10 or 15 years before, and I think we've talked about this a little bit on your channel, but I was in a cosmology course as a freshman at Notre Dame, and I learned for the first time that the Big Bang Theory was actually developed by a Catholic priest, and that there was kind of a conscientious internal, debate and kind of, multiple accepted views when it came to kind of interpretation of the early chapters of Genesis. This blew my mind because I grew up in an environment that, I mean, it was very much set up that if you were a creationist, you believed in, 10,000-year-old Earth. I mean, it was just there was just no nuance. There was no, multiple options. It was kind of like, or you believe in evolution and that denies God. It was such a simple, and I never, I just sort of took it at face value, never kind of looked into it. So it truly blew my mind. And I say that because I think there's a lot of value in that. I think, the church leaning in to their great tradition of philosophy and to their great tradition of science. I think that's the kind of stuff that will help bridge gaps between ourselves and the secular world. I think it is doing that. It's not just like hypothetically. I think it is. I mean, I think about, even people like, for myself, I mean, I wasn't by any means a professional philosopher, but I was kind of interested in that kind of stuff. And I was certainly drawn into Catholicism by a lot of ideas that were not theology per se, right? It was sort of related
mhm,
ideas that I came to see as credible that then made me start to investigate the underlying theology. Because once you start to see, oh, wait, maybe that worldview has something to it. No
right.
matter how you think that, right? Doesn't I mean, in a sense, it doesn't matter if it's a theology or a philosophical view or whatever that makes you first have that thought. But that's a
Mhm,
great thing. That's an opportunity for us as Catholics to kind of be
yeah,
like, well, let's kind of talk about truth more broadly, and let's talk about like our understanding of truth and like how, epistemology, and like how do we come to know things, and it's really fascinating because you talked about that with science, right? I mean, the sort of the assumption with all of science is that our observations are somewhat reliable and that we actually can discern, glean information from that which, we observe. And that of itself has a lot of Christian underlying assumptions in terms of objective
yeah.
reality and our being autonomous, self-discerning, conscious beings who are able to observe external, factors internally. I mean, there's a lot of underlying assumptions there from a
Oh, yeah,
philosophical
sure.
standpoint, from a scientific standpoint, and that's right up my alley. So we can nerd out over philosophy anytime you want. That's very much in
Yeah,
line with this. I think that will very much appeal to my audience as well. So
yeah,
never
and
apologize about that.
science makes an act of faith,
Mm,
and that's where the church supplies the basis for that faith. And the faith is that things that we have not yet discovered can be known and understood. You
mm,
cannot demonstrate that in lab. You can't demonstrate that logistically. That's an act of faith. So why do we presuppose that what we don't even know about, we haven't even discovered, that we can discover it and we can actually make sense of it, right?
mm.
How do we
Yeah.
know that? That's because of that imperative we talked about that the church imposed on its believers. So it's kind of funny, in my book, Revolt Against Reality, I have a chapter called "Thank God for Organized Religion," because it's like if it's not an organized religion, if there wasn't an institutional church, there couldn't have been this imperative, right?
Mhm.
At least not
Yeah.
in its strictest form, which would have probably not started modern science, at least as we know it today.
No, it's so fascinating. And it's sad in some sense that the mischaracterizations abound when it comes to religion and science, right? The sort of the
Yeah.
perceived incompatibility of them. But I think there's some, we bear some guilt there. We bear some fault, no doubt, in presenting things poorly and kind of, latching on to things at different
Yeah.
points in history. I don't mean you and I necessarily. I just mean sort of broadly speaking of, Christians don't always do themselves a great service in kind of clinging to ideas that maybe are kind of tangentially related, and then they kind of
Yeah.
become much bigger, right? I think of politics or any number of sort of sociological kind of ideas that can kind of start to take the center stage. You're like, wait, all Christians believe that? Like, that's wild. It's like, well, some Christians have taken their beliefs to that conclusion, but that's sort of a side issue, and that's kind of it's a distraction. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I feel like so often like we as Christians kind of bring up issues that maybe are almost distractions from our presentation of the truth. At least, I mean, this is something I reflect on a lot in my own life. At least I'm guilty of it. But well, I do want to be. Let's see. Let's see. I know. Well, we've covered a lot of the topics that I wanted to touch on. But I do want to make sure. I'm just looking over my notes to make sure I didn't like completely miss something. Yeah, so I think we talked about the symbolism a bit, but I guess maybe zooming back in onto what we mean by myth when it comes to the Christ narrative. And I think a lot of people talk about, oh, well, that's just kind of based on all these other
Yeah.
myths, and it's just sort of another iteration of something. Is that something that you address in your book? I mean, is there any kind of insight you can? I mean, whether it is or not, I'm curious. Just kind of if you can give us some insight
Yeah,
there.
not directly, but I think everything in my book would argue against that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, oh yeah,
Just
I'm sure.
yeah, I mean, like even the rabbi disciple aspect, right there, you don't have myth coming into play, right? If anything, it's a way to exclude myth. Um, but yeah, the I don't I don't give a lot of credence to this idea that they're borrowing from myth. Boy, I could go on and on. There's problems about that. There's no canonical version of myths. It's like what there may be one aspect that was held in a particular location at one time, and
Mm-hmm.
another one, and then we're viewing it from the past. We're looking at it from the present, and we kind of put them all together into a full blown myth. When actually, if you took a time machine back to the first century, they wouldn't have made that same conclusion because this one thing would have sounded a little bit like Christ, but none of the other stuff would, and that's one problem. I mean, there's a lot of problems with the myth thing, and again, you have to answer the big questions. Uh, why is there a church today? That's all around the world.
Mm-hmm.
That stems from Jesus. And the other one's like, what about all the over engineering that occurs in the Gospels? I mean, it's ludicrous when you go through all the different layers of mnemonic layering and also the imperative to verify. All of that breaks down. There's no way this could be a legend, and it couldn't be a cumulative myth.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just totally unconvinced of that.
No, I think you're exactly right. I think that you hit the nail on the head. I'm glad. I think in some ways I was just selfishly looking for a better way to articulate what I already believed, right? And
Yeah,
I think you hit the nail on the head with the sort of anachronistic approach, right? There's sort of an anachronistic search for a way to disprove it, right? Which I mean brings us back to the incredulity, right? It's like approaching the
right.
topic with disbelief as the assumption, and then kind of going back into it, and then making a sort of tenuous claim based on um, things that wouldn't have been viewed from from that context at all, had it been actually happening in real time, historically. And maybe that's the danger of our point in history, like our perspective, right? We have the and then we talked about earlier, right? Like you would think that it's a great thing, right? We could access, the ubiquitous access to information. Like we can just prove it. Let's just settle it all. But we
Yeah,
can't.
right.
We haven't been able to, right? And it's interesting because then it starts to become about, I mean, I don't want to be too cynical, and I'm certainly not a cynic, but I don't want to sound too cynical, but it's almost like it becomes more about the narratives and how we piece together, like that what we
Yeah,
perceive, or at least that seems to be what the battle is now. The ideas war almost is more about narratives, and that kind of brings us a little bit back to the worldview conversation. If we can
right.
attract someone to the worldview, we can start there.
Yeah, I you know I, you hit as always. You get me thinking, right? There's one of my favorite shows on TV on cable is Curse of Oak Island with the
Ooh.
Oak Island Treasury. Kind of cool stuff. Um, but I love what I do is I love to study the conspiracy theories. that
Mm.
they bring in. Maybe this was the Templars that traveled to this island off Nova Scotia.
They did so much,
And
didn't they?
yeah, and what you find is, and you'll find this everywhere with any kind of theory, right? Is they're looking for connections,
Mm.
right? So they'll say, okay, the Templars had a cross, Templars had this, that, this. The evidence has this, so therefore one made the other, right?
Mm.
But the problem is you're looking for things that go together, right?
Mhm.
So you're
Mhm.
going to make a that's how you get your theory. So like with a mythicist, right? Um, what I do whenever somebody brings up parallelism, I focus on the differences, no matter what it is. Okay. So let's say Jesus is like Zeus. Okay. And then they'll say X, Y, and Z. They both believe this about Zeus and they believe this about Jesus. Well, I start looking, okay, let's look at Zeus and see where it doesn't square with Jesus. Right. And what I think that gives you a better perspective,
Mm. Mm.
because then it's like, okay, this conspiracy theory or whatever theory it is doesn't seem to hold water because it seems like there's a lot more things that are completely different,
Mm.
than
Yeah.
are the same. They're just cherry picking couple, elements that seem to connect the two. And so that, yeah, Curse of Oak Island. I like it just because it gives you a chance to sit back on something that's not like life and death, eternal life and death at stake, and just say, okay, yeah, I don't think the Templars. I think that cross doesn't look like it's a Christian cross or something like that.
No, it's good. We all need some forms of healthy escapism, I suppose. The History Channel's not the worst kind of it. I think that's History Channel, right? The Curse of Oak Island.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
no. That's it's interesting that you said that, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you can see if you start looking for patterns, you're going to start seeing them. Um, but then it
yeah.
also makes me kind of think a little bit of we have to, and we talked earlier about measuring kind of the cumulative cases and talking about the probabilistic weight of kind of an argument. And like, sure, you can kind of say these, well, what about, right? That's kind of the common rebuttal to any number of things. Well, what about this, as if it sort of disproves everything. But then what we have
Right.
to actually do is like take that. Maybe it's a valid, you know, thing to consider, whatever that response is. But then we have to compare it to, well, what were the Christians doing as a result of what they encountered historically? And then we see like the
Mhm.
martyrs and the kind of the early church and the way it spread. So then it's like I start to think like, and this is impossible to measure, right? I'm speaking in ways that's like there's no way for us to actually like dig in and come up with a math equation. But then it almost becomes more of a measurement of weighing the probabilistic weight of them being misguided in their martyrdom and their willingness to follow Christ into the lion's den, quite literally at times. And then our kind of like skeptical claims of tying together these little like, well, that dot
Mm.
and then that dot and then that dot. And then it starts to become a little bit less of a strong, compelling like rebuttal when you start thinking about it in those terms. I think that's all of that's just to say, we have to, it's so easy to start getting trapped when we don't have the context, trapped without context, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah,
I
and
don't know.
humility too. Uh,
Yeah,
one
humility.
one important thing that I learned was from a man named Howard Bromberg, one of the most intelligent persons I ever met on the planet. Uh, he is a Harvard trained lawyer.
Oh,
He's a
wow.
Jewish convert who intellectually became Catholic. Catholicism seemed reasonable to him.
That's
He
fascinating.
can play multiple chess games.
Yeah.
He's just a brilliant guy. And so one of the things he likes to study is the Kennedy assassination, which he believes there was a lone shooter. And I asked him, what about the magic bullet? That's like the one piece of evidence. I don't know if you're familiar with the Kennedy assassination
Only
thing.
a little bit, like enough to kind of follow along, but I can't really get into the details.
Yeah, one of the biggest for multiple shooters is the magic bullet because we know exactly how many bullets were fired at Kennedy.
Mm.
And in order to account for all the bullet wounds and deflections and everything, this one bullet had to have zigzagged in all sorts of directions,
Right,
right?
right.
And so I said, okay, Howard, how do you explain the magic bullet? And Howard, and he's a lawyer. He was a New York prosecutor. He said, it doesn't matter. I would discount it. It's like, you can't just wave a wand and say it doesn't matter. He said, look, all sorts of weird things happen in life, So maybe the bullet just acted weird or something or whatever. You always go with the preponderance of the evidence, right? If there's outlying evidence that goes in a different direction, you got to throw it out. And I thought, okay, but you're so smart. I thought he'd have a better answer, right? Well, later on, like years later, I'm watching this documentary. I don't know if the documentary is true or whatever, so I don't want hate mail for multiple shooter theorists or whatever. But and maybe this was debunked, but I thought this was a great example of Howard's point. See, what they did was using computer generated graphics. They showed the magic bullet, all the different ways in which it would have to go to, and they said, but the problem is, people always assume that the back seat and the front seat were level. No, wait, yeah, were level, and therefore the bullet had to make all these things. But it's actually the back seat was raised in that car, and when you raise it, it's a straight line. Now, see, that was a fact that you didn't put into consideration before, right? And it would have made it all square, right? So that taught me a lesson that preponderance of the evidence is the way to go, really, in many cases, because there are just facts we don't know, right? Or we're
Yeah,
not
that's
taking into consideration.
no, that's a really helpful framework. 'Cause I think I've sort of organically applied that myself, but not really known that I was applying it in a sense, because there often are those times where they seem to be kind of like very compelling objections where it's like, what about this? Right. And
Yeah.
you're like, well, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then that's
Right.
a really like terrible place to be in, at least in terms of like epistemic certainty, right? Which is something that is maybe an impossible goal to achieve anyways, but that's kind of, I think we all want it, right? We want to be like absolutely certain in what we believe, which I think that comes back to the humility and the kind of healthy skepticism kind of,
Mm-hmm.
but then, yeah, it's a really interesting thing because just because there is there's something that we cannot explain, it doesn't mean that everything else that has caused us to believe something to date is automatically like reduced to nothing, because who knows? We might be lacking that context. We might be
Yeah.
lacking that perspective that we need to actually understand it. So it's interesting because, and also I think just practically speaking, although this is a much less compelling reason not to do that, but it's also like it's almost an impossible life to just continue to chase those objections when it's just like, well, what about this? I mean, you find yourself kind of getting to the point where you have really no certainty about anything. It's almost becomes this like internal
Yeah. If you want to be
yeah.
consistent, right? It's like your whole worldview kind of
If you want to be consistent, you're right. That's an
falls
assumption
apart,
I'm
right?
making, right? If you want
Yeah.
that internal consistency and you want to maintain that, yeah, you're going to drive yourself crazy if you don't, um,
Yeah.
yeah, give yourself a little bit of room there.
Yeah.
Well, this has been fantastic, Gary. Is there anything else that that you kind of think is worth talking about with respect to this conversation? I mean, I've kind of covered the main stuff, but I mean, I have time. I want to be respectful of your schedule, but I mean, if there's anything else that you think is worth kind of diving into, I'm happy to.
No, I think we covered the basis and more. With you, I think we would be on forever.
That's a
Because you
dangerous
always
thought. It's
come
like
up
it's like
with
we
some
either end
interesting
now
connections.
or it's like a 5-hour stream, and then like both of our wives are sending angry emails or something. So, um, well, no, that's no, this has been great. So, I mean, I guess then more practically speaking, and I'll include a link after the fact as well. But for people who are listening to this, where should they go? To buy your books, like what's your kind of preferred site? I know you're on Amazon, but I am always hesitant to recommend Amazon because I know that like pricing can be different. So like, where should people go if they want to, purchase some of your books? And I definitely think that you all should. And moreover, actually, I just want to kind of do this. This sort of came to me just while we're on this line. If anyone is doubting, what Gary and I have been talking about with respect to the gospel narratives, and wants to dive into his book, I'd be happy to purchase a copy for you. So seriously, reach out to me. I would be happy to. I'm talking to the to the audience, but Gary, I'll buy it. I'll be happy to do that for someone if there's someone that's interested. I want them to have those tools. So yeah, reach out to me. And I only have a couple hundred followers, so I probably won't regret saying this. But if I keep growing, then these types of things will very quickly.
Yeah, if you keep promising freebies, it's gonna be astronomical.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, as someone, I've never written a book, but I've written way too many essays and articles and the like, and I know it's extremely time intensive and the research process and all that kind of stuff. But more importantly, I mean, I want people to dive into these things. Like, I want people to have that healthy skepticism, but I also don't want people to have the skepticism that makes them scared to approach these subjects, because that's what kind of upsets me in some sense more, is when people have this kind of like it's refusal to engage. And I see that on the religious and anti-religious side alike, almost this
Yes.
refusal to engage in ideas, and that just drives me crazy, because long before I was Catholic, I was a believer in open discourse and this kind of concept of truth, the truth kind of, I don't know, not like the truth revealing itself in a sense, but kind of like if you give an honest investigation, that like you can come to understand things to be true. And I don't know what I'm trying to say exactly, but I guess I believed in the transcendental concept of truth long before I believed in the Catholic iteration of it. So it always kind of frustrates me when I see people kind of failing to engage. So thank you for letting me engage. And I know I was also kind of playing a little bit of devil's advocate, kind of asking questions, because I want people to be open about that. I want people to, come here and not be like, think that we're an echo chamber in a sense. Well, we are an echo chamber in one sense, but at the same time, like, I would hope that, people stumbling upon this, might be, might be drawn to actually investigate further. So, so I didn't actually let you answer the question. I'm so sorry. Where should people buy your books?
At stpaulcenter.com for the gospel truth. stpaulcenter.com. The other books you could probably get at catholic.com, and my website's handsonapologetics.com.
Perfect. And then let's see. I'm putting all these in the chat as well for people. And then I know that also you mentioned, is it what's your YouTube channel one more time? I'm a subscriber and I can't remember the name. I'm so sorry.
Oh, yeah. The Apocrypha Apocalypse.
Apocrypha Apocalypse. Fantastic. And
Or
that's
you
on
could just do a
YouTube.
search with my name. That'll come up that way, or William Albrecht. That'll come up
Fantastic.
as well.
Well, Gary, it is always a pleasure, and like you said, we could talk for much longer. But I think this is the good thing about kind of having a pre-existing topic of discussion, and it kind of sets some boundaries for us, guardrails, if you will. But
Right.
is there anything else that you just kind of want to say before we sign off to our audience? There's only a couple people left on, but we've had a few dozen watching throughout, so this is good.
Yeah. Just have a skeptic. You could be skeptical. It's just got to be a healthy skepticism. But you're right, though. You got to be careful not to fall into extremes of incredulity or credulity. Because you're right. There is a kind of parallel between fundamentalist Protestants and fundamentalist atheists. They're almost identical. So yeah. So I think we've gone through some good tips, I think, to just make sure that you're skeptical, and it's a good balanced skepticism.
Absolutely. And like you said earlier a couple of times, humility is really the kind of the key to, I think, avoiding those extremes in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And we did just get a comment asking about if you have any first century Jewish texts to read, recommendations. I don't know if you have any anything that fits the bill. I'm guessing kind of with respect to this conversation and kind of your research, if you have anything to kind of point people to.
First century Jewish text. In regards to the truthfulness of the Gospels, I'm not sure in regards to what.
Let's see. We might get a live answer in the chat. We can kind of I'm not exactly sure. I'm guessing it's kind of with respect to what we were talking about at the beginning, maybe when we were talking about the language and in association with the Deuterocanon, he said.
Oh, okay. Well, the Gospels, New Testament, are Jewish text, first century. There's not a lot in the first century, so Flavius Josephus.
Josephus.
You could use that. The problem is there's also rabbinic literature, but the problem is some of it might be as early as the first century, but it's you have to be very careful about things in Jewish literature as far as their claims. But buy my book. I give you lots of lots of text and so on. Off the top of my head, I can't think of anything.
No worries. We can also follow up via email, and I'm in a Discord server with the guy asking, so I can actually follow up with him at a
Okay.
later date. So if anything
Yeah, I
comes
have
to
a
mind, I
feeling
can pass it
there's
along.
something specific he's looking for. So if
Yeah, he said like
just
for
let me know
example,
and I'll play.
he just added, for example, Akiba Ben Yosef, and I don't
Oh,
speak
okay.
Hebrew.
Yeah, I
I
think
don't know
he's
if
talking
that's
about
helpful.
Septa Yadaim. I think it's 3:5.
Hmm.
It's interesting. There's this second century Jewish rabbi. So technically, he's not first century.
We'll let it
Who
slide.
wrote a dictum that the Gospels and the was it the Gospels and the books of the heretics do not defile the hands. They're not sacred. The book of Ben Sira and the books written after Ben Sira are not sacred. They don't defile the hands,
Hmm.
and that's very interesting because he's making this dictum, which suggests that perhaps there are Jews that hold these books as sacred, like the Gospels, the New Testament, the Book of Sirach, and books written after Sirach, namely the Deuterocanon. And you know, that implies a lot that you have this dictum coming from Akiba at the beginning of the second Christian century, and that the Deuterocanon seems to be associated with the Gospel. So apparently, this is against Jewish Christians.
Hmm. That's really interesting. I admit that I am woefully ignorant of sort of the historical kind of side. I've read a lot of the fathers, but it was much more for like theological purposes, not historical. So when we start
Right.
getting into the historical side, I'm fascinated by it, but I'm very much outside my wheelhouse, which is kind of interesting. Maybe that's just because I believed all the saints. The saints made a pretty compelling case, I suppose, don't they?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. It's one of those square pegs round hole things.
Mm.
You know,
Ah,
it's
yeah.
like how do you explain that? It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Oh, interesting. I missed this a long time ago. This was probably about an hour ago. But when we were talking earlier, Drew the Catholic, he asked, or he said he thinks of Petrie. I'm guessing, is it Brent Petrie?
Yeah, bring up Petrie. Yeah,
Work as an example of this recontextualizing the New Testament around Judaism,
yeah.
making sense of many things that we believe, and he just was kind of drawing a parallel between that and Petrie's work, which I think is a absolutely a right connection.
Yeah, that's a compliment. Thank you.
Yeah,
Brent
no.
Petrie does great work.
Yeah, he does. I need to kind of dive back into him. Oh, this is good. Yeah, it's funny. Right when we're talking, I'm kind of not aware of all the comments sometimes. But I don't know if you can see this. But he also said earlier, I think in many ways Catholics are discovering the things we believe purely by means of passing down the tradition are really and truly rooted in Scripture.
Yeah.
And I think that's absolutely true. And I think that's where we have the sort of the luxury, right? Because I mean, tradition and scripture don't contradict one another. So in some sense, even our ignorance of scripture, we got away with it. Perhaps if I can kind of anachronistically kind of
Yeah.
take that
Right.
upon myself too, we kind of got away with it as Catholics for a long time because we could lean on tradition. And fortunately,
Right.
tradition didn't lead us astray. It's still bad that we, in a sense, that that it was kind of like that scripture was maybe undervalued, if it was, or when it
Yeah.
was. But it's interesting because when you have the kind of the two streams, and truth can't contradict itself, right? So
Mhm.
when properly understood, it's just a powerful force. Makes me think. Oh, we're getting. See, this is great. See, if we kept talking and then the questions started coming in. So, let's see. And then let's see. Kevin non-tratty calf. Hey Kevin. I am very late, but this topic strikes me as both extremely interesting and important. And now I feel really silly because I thought there was a question, but it's a really great comment nonetheless. But
Yeah.
Kevin,
Thanks.
thank you. And now it feels just sort of self-congratulatory. I just sort of like posted a comment that was really just a compliment of us, and I meant for it to be a question, but I promise there wasn't ulterior reasons there. But no, this is great, and it seems that what you're saying is really resonating with people. I've shared all the links there so people can access your content. I definitely encourage that. And like I said earlier, if anyone is kind of skeptical and wants to dive in, I'd be happy to pick up a copy of Gary's new book for you and send it to you. So feel free to reach out privately on YouTube or Twitter. And with that, Gary, I just want to thank you again. I know I keep saying thank you, and I'm going to let you go, but then I don't. And the comments keep coming in. So, can I ask you one more question? I'm so sorry because it's deeply ironic now, but a
Oh,
question
sure.
did come
That's
through
fine.
right as I was saying that. Um, he asked about, did this podcast discuss the modern scholarly consensus that none of the fathers of the Torah existed? If so, what does that have to do with that mythic history? Does that question make sense to you? Because I don't think we touched on it. So he's asking about the
No.
modern scholarly consensus that none of the fathers of the Torah existed. If so,
Okay.
what do we do with that mythic history?
What do we do with those scholars?
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah. When I say consensus, I mean consensus of data points, not consensus of scholars, right?
That's a
Because
good distinction.
a million Frenchmen can be wrong, a million scholars can be wrong too. And if you know anything about biblical scholarship, you know that there was some really bad theories that they held sway, in various academic schools for a long, long time before they're debunked. So, um, yeah.
I think that is the
But
answer
no, I
then,
didn't
right?
touch on
Is
Yeah.
just not that is consensus of scholars doesn't necessarily mean consensus of information. Um,
Right.
and that is an interesting thing, right? When we think about the time, I don't know, almost the time weighted value. I don't know if that's the right way to talk about the time weighted value of these information. Like you said, like sometimes a movement will hold sway and will be even like a mainstream movement, and then it will kind of disappear into history. I mean, we think of all the great the heresies never disappear, do they? They always come back, but that's another story. Well, Gary, my friend, thank you so much for joining me. You have single-handedly elevated my series of interviews. Considering we have only done two of them, and you're the second one, so you have
I was going to
distinctly
say, I
elevated them.
thought I was first. Yeah. Very
No,
good.
I had one of my good friends who is an Orthodox investigating Catholicism and Coptic Christianity,
Oh,
and
cool.
I had him on to talk about avoiding indifferentism, on your search for truth, because he and I have kind of come to different conclusions, at least so far. But we talked a lot about that, and it's kind of like coming back to this certainty issue and everything like that.
Right.
But and then I have a couple ones lined up. I was going to do this without you on the line, but I guess I'll just say that we have a couple more lined up. Michael Lofton's coming on later this month, and then I have one with Austin Suggs, who is also someone else who's been kind of very openly investigating Catholicism and Orthodoxy online. He runs a show called The Gospel Simplicity, and then a couple more kind of coming up. But that's kind of the next three. So it'll be good, and it'll kind of be very much in line with this, right? Kind of exploring ideas of interest and kind of a conversation format, pseudo interview, pseudo conversation. So thank you for being a sort of guinea pig of sorts. I know it was a little clunky with me kind of figuring out my flow and everything, but
Oh,
hopefully there was some good stuff for people. I know I learned a lot, so thank you
yeah,
again.
it's a lot of fun. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Well, Gary, I hope you have a great night, and everyone else, thank you as well, and good night to you all. So take care.